At Arizona State University, we've made online education better, smarter, and more personalized so you can go further in your aspiring field.
I decided to pursue medicine once I realized that ASU did have the online program for biological sciences. You're still required to learn the same curriculum. You're still being tested on the same content that anyone would be tested on in person. The comprehensiveness of the program prepared me so well for medical school.
Explore over 300 programs at asuonline.asu.edu.
Another day, another headline, right? It seems like every time you turn around, there's news about yet another company getting hit by some kind of cyber attack.
Yeah, it's relentless.
It's like it's become almost, well, normal.
I know, right? You almost become numb to it after a while.
And that's scary because this stuff affects every single one of us. I mean, think about it. Everything from buying groceries online to, our bank accounts, even our medical records, it's all out there in the digital world. And that means it's all potentially vulnerable.
Absolutely. And it's not just about big companies or organizations either. Cybercriminals are increasingly targeting individuals too.
So for this deep dive, we really wanted to get into the nitty-gritty of what's going on in the world of cybersecurity right now.
We're going to try to unpack some of the key threats that are out there, what's motivating the people behind these attacks, and, most importantly, what we can all do to protect ourselves.
Exactly. And to do that, we're going to be taking a deep dive into a really interesting discussion we found. It was from Capital Radio's Cyber Afterwork show.
Oh, I know that one.
Yeah, it featured Eduardo Castillo and Pablo Santamario, and a guest with a really fascinating perspective, María Apedador Montoya. She's a criminologist who specializes in cybersecurity.
That's a really interesting angle. Criminology.
I know, right? I mean, we often think about cybersecurity as this really technical field, which it is, of course, but bringing in that criminological perspective, understanding what makes these cyber criminals tick.
The human element.
Exactly. It gives us this whole other layer of understanding. So, ready to jump in?
Let's do it.
The show started by talking about a recent cyber attack on the Consum supermarket chain.
Consum? That's a big one.
Yeah, it is. In fact, they even had to ask their customers to change their passwords as a precaution.
Oh, wow. That's never a good sign.
Nope. And it really got me thinking about how, like we were saying earlier, we're almost becoming desensitized to these kinds of attacks. They happen so often now. It's almost like we just shrug our shoulders and say, oh, well, there's another one.
And that's exactly what the hosts on the show were saying. They were talking about this danger of complacency. We hear about these attacks so frequently that we kind of start to think, oh, it'll never happen to me.
Right. But the reality is that anyone can be a target. And that's why it's so important to stay vigilant and take those basic steps to protect ourselves.
Like what kinds of steps?
Well, they had a whole list of recommendations, but the big ones were making sure you're using strong, unique passwords for all your online accounts.
Ugh, I know. Such a pain to remember all those different passwords.
I know, right? But there are tools that can help with that. And then there's enabling two-factor authentication wherever you can.
Two-factor authentication, that's the one where you have to enter a code from your phone or something, right?
Exactly. It adds an extra layer of security.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, just being really careful about what links you click on and who you give your personal information to online, especially if it seems a bit fishy.
Good old common sense.
It really does go a long way. They also talked about this idea of the before, during, and after of a cyber incident.
Interesting. Tell me more.
So before is all about prevention, right? Putting those security measures in place to hopefully stop attacks from happening in the first place. Then during is all about containment and damage control, trying to figure out what happened, who got in, and how to stop it from spreading. And then after is where you really dig into the lessons learned, analyze what went wrong, and make changes to your security policies and systems to prevent similar attacks from happening again. So in the case of Consum, they're probably right in the thick of that during phase right now. They're trying to figure out exactly how the attackers got in and how much damage was done. But what's really important is that they don't skip over that crucial after phase.
Yeah, absolutely. That's where the real long-term change happens.
I know. And hopefully it'll prompt other organizations to take a good hard look at their own cybersecurity posture and make sure they're doing everything they can to prevent something similar from happening to them.
Hopefully they learn from others' mistakes, right?
Fingers crossed. Now, another area that they talked about that really stood out to me was the healthcare sector.
Oh, yeah. That's a big one.
It is. They referenced a report from BL Media, which was based on something called the State of CPS Security.
CPS, what's that stand for?
Cyber Physical Systems. Basically things like medical devices, industrial control systems, Anything that's got both a computer component and a physical component.
Got it.
And the really alarming statistic from that report was that they're predicting that 9 out of 10 healthcare organizations could have vulnerable devices by 2025.
9 out of 10. That's a staggering number.
It is. And, part of the reason for this is that medical equipment often has a really long lifespan. I mean, think about those big MRI machines or those patient monitoring systems. Hospitals expect them to last for years and years. But that also means that a lot of this equipment could be running on really old software, like they mentioned Windows XP, which is practically ancient in the tech world.
Oh, wow. That's like using a flip phone in the age of smartphones.
Yeah, pretty much. And the problem is that those old systems are often no longer supported by the manufacturer, so they don't get security updates, which means any new vulnerabilities that are discovered are just left wide open for attackers to exploit.
And I imagine it's not that easy to just swap out those old systems for newer ones.
Right. They're often really specialized pieces of equipment, and they're critical for patient care, so updating them can be incredibly complicated and risky.
So it's kind of a catch-22. You need to update them for security, but doing so could disrupt essential services or even put patients at risk.
Exactly. The experts on the show are really emphasizing that manufacturers need to step up and provide long-term support and security updates for these essential medical devices.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
They also talked about the importance of isolating these vulnerable systems within the healthcare network. Using things like firewalls and network segmentation to prevent an attacker from moving laterally through the system if one device does get compromised.
Right. So even if they manage to get in, they can't get access to the really sensitive stuff like patient records or other critical systems. It's like damage control.
Precisely. But it does raise a bigger question. Who's ultimately responsible for addressing all this? I mean, is it the hospitals, the government, regulatory bodies? It feels like it's going to take a really coordinated effort.
Oh, for sure. You need everyone pulling in the same direction.
Right. Okay, now this is where the conversation took a really fascinating turn. María Apedador Montoya, the criminologist we mentioned earlier, joined the discussion, and she brought a whole new perspective to the table.
I'm all ears.
They talked about her journey from studying traditional criminology to focusing on the digital world, this genesis delictiva, the evolving origins of crime.
It's like crime is adapting, evolving right along with technology.
Exactly. I mean, crime has always found new avenues to exploit, right?
Yeah.
And the internet and our digital devices have just become the latest frontier.
The new Wild West.
Exactly. And one of the really interesting points that she made was about the connection between traditional major crimes, things like the illegal arms trade, drug trafficking, human trafficking, and how cybercrime has become this major funding source for these activities.
Wow. So it's not just isolated incidents anymore. It's really embedded in these large-scale criminal enterprises.
Exactly. She even said that if cybercrime were a country, it would be the third largest world power economically. That's how big of an impact it's having.
That's pretty mind-blowing.
I know. Now, when they talked about the challenges that people on the good side, law enforcement, cybersecurity professionals are facing, she made a really interesting point. She said it's often not a lack of skilled people, but a lack of resources.
That's always a problem.
Yeah, she talked about things like bureaucracy and really slow processes within law enforcement that just can't keep up with the speed and the global reach of cybercrime.
It's like they're fighting a 21st century battle with 20th century tools.
Right. And she also really emphasized the lack of public awareness and basic digital literacy as a major vulnerability. It's like a lot of people just don't have the knowledge they need to protect themselves online.
And that makes them easy targets.
Exactly. So she actually founded this mobile application called Bibalc, which is specifically designed to help individuals protect themselves online. It does things like verifying links, answering people's cybersecurity questions, providing education on how to stay safe online, and it can even help people who have already fallen victim to a scam.
That sounds really useful.
It does, right. And I think it really speaks to the need for more user-friendly tools and resources that can help people navigate this increasingly complex digital landscape.
I agree.
Okay, so switching gears a bit, they also talked about the motivations and the evolution of cybercriminals.
Okay, what did they have to say about that?
Well, it's interesting because we often have this image of cybercriminals as being these lone wolf hackers, sitting in their basements somewhere, just kind of doing it for the challenge or the thrill of it.
Yeah, that classic Hollywood image.
But the reality is much more complex. For one thing, traditional criminal activities are now heavily reliant on cybercrime for funding. So there's a huge financial incentive.
I mean, it makes sense, right? It's less risky than robbing a bank.
Exactly. And she also talked about how for some younger people, there's this element of ego involved. Like, it's a way to prove their skills, to show off, to gain recognition within their own circles.
A bit like those graffiti artists, but in the digital world.
Yeah, there are definitely some parallels there. And then for those who become more entrenched in cybercrime, the motivations often become a mix of financial gain, ego, and sometimes even a sense of ideology, like those hacktivists who use their skills to promote a political cause.
It's interesting how those motivations can evolve over time.
It is. She also talked about how some cybercriminals, particularly those who are driven by ego, actually crave recognition. Like, some of them have even tried to contact her directly to brag about their exploits.
That's a little creepy.
It is. And then there's this really tricky question of rehabilitation. Can people who've been involved in cybercrime be rehabilitated and brought back into society? And it sounds like there are no easy answers there.
I can imagine every case is probably different.
Right. It depends on the individual, their motivations, the severity of their crimes, their willingness to change. It's a whole can of worms.
Definitely.
Now, here's another really important point that she made, and this might surprise some people. We often think of cybercriminals as being in some far-off country, right?
Yeah, like some shadowy figure in a hoodie in a dark room somewhere overseas.
Exactly. But she actually stressed that a lot of cybercrime originates much closer to home. While the really big, sophisticated operations might be based overseas, a lot of the everyday scams and attacks are happening right here in our own communities.
Oh, wow. I hadn't really thought about that.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that cybercrime isn't just something that happens to other people. It can happen to anyone, anywhere.
Makes it feel a lot more real.
It does. Now, they also spend some time talking about the impact that cybercrime has on its victims. And this is where it really gets heartbreaking. I mean, beyond the financial losses, there's this whole emotional and psychological toll.
Yeah, it's not just about the money.
Exactly. She talked about how a lot of victims, particularly older individuals and women, experience feelings of guilt and shame. They blame themselves for falling for a scam, for not being careful enough.
That's awful.
It is. And it can really make people withdraw from others. They're embarrassed. They don't want to talk about it. And then with things like pyramid schemes, there can be really serious social consequences.
Yeah, you hear stories about people losing friends and family over that kind of thing.
It's just devastating. And often, people don't even realize they've been scammed until it's too late, until they've already lost a significant amount of money, or they're being threatened with extortion.
So prevention is key.
Absolutely. And that means being aware of the different types of scams that are out there. They talked about everything from romance scams and those phishing emails to fake online ads and those faster, more impulsive kinds of scams that really prey on people's emotions or their desire for a quick deal.
It's like they have a scam for every personality type.
They really do. And the key takeaway here is that anyone can be a victim. It doesn't matter how smart or tech savvy you think you are. If you're not careful, you could fall prey to one of these scams.
So what can we do?
Well, one interesting idea that came up was this concept of recruiting cybersecurity talent from, let's just say unconventional sources.
Unconventional, you mean?
People who might have previously been involved in illicit hacking activities.
Oh, I see. Kind of like turning poachers into gamekeepers.
Exactly. It's a controversial idea, but it's definitely something to think about. And then there's the whole debate about screen time and cybersecurity education, which is particularly relevant for parents.
Oh, yeah. That's a big one.
It is. And Maria actually had a really interesting perspective on this. She said that excessive screen time is more of a mental health concern, and the real focus when it comes to cybersecurity should be on educating parents about the digital risks their children face.
Makes sense. It's not just about how much time they're spending online, but what they're doing online.
Exactly. It's about teaching them how to navigate the online world safely, just like we teach them how to cross the street safely. But the challenge is that a lot of parents aren't digital natives themselves. They didn't grow up with this technology.
Right, so they might not even be aware of all the risks.
And different age groups use social media and the internet in different ways, so there's no one-size-fits-all approach to digital safety. It's something that parents really need to stay on top of.
It's a constantly evolving landscape.
It really is. They also had some specific recommendations for businesses, which I thought were really insightful.
Okay, like...
Well, she made this really interesting point about how traditional security training, which often focuses on protecting the company, can be really ineffective.
Yeah, it's all about policies and procedures and compliance. It can feel very impersonal.
Exactly. So she suggested that businesses should really focus on highlighting the personal benefits of cybersecurity for the individual employee, like how being cyber aware can help protect their own families, their own personal information, their own finances.
So making it more relevant to their everyday lives.
Exactly. Because if they see a direct benefit for themselves, they're much more likely to pay attention and actually implement those security practices, both at work and at home.
I like that approach.
Me too. Okay, so in the last part of the show, they brought in a segment from Panda Security, which kind of brought us full circle back to that earlier discussion about vulnerabilities in essential services. They reported a 42% increase in cyber intrusions, targeting things like electricity grids, water management systems, critical infrastructure.
Oh, wow. That's really worrying.
It is. And then they talked about how these attacks can be incredibly disruptive and even dangerous. Imagine if someone managed to shut down the power grid for a major city.
That doesn't even bear thinking about.
I know, it's scary stuff. And the types of attacks they were talking about were things like phishing, ransomware, denial of service attacks, all aimed at either extorting money or just causing chaos.
It's like they're trying to hold society hostage.
It really is.
Yeah.
And they also pointed out that the current geopolitical climate is definitely contributing to this increase in attacks.
Yeah, you're always going to see an uptick in that kind of activity when there's tension between countries.
Right. And the solutions that they proposed really echoed a lot of things that Maria had been talking about earlier. Investing in training for people, making sure there are enough resources allocated to cybersecurity, isolating those critical systems, and using new technologies like artificial intelligence to help detect and respond to threats.
So a multi-pronged approach.
Exactly. And they really hammered home the point that this is not just an IT issue anymore. It's a business issue, it's a societal issue, and it's something that we all need to be taking seriously.
And proactively.
Yes. It's not enough to just react after an attack has happened. We need to be proactive about putting those security measures in place.
Prevention is better than cure.
100%. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what would you say are the biggest takeaways for our listeners?
I'd say the biggest takeaway is that cybercrime is a very real and present danger, and it's something that affects all of us. Whether we're individuals, businesses, or even entire governments, it's constantly evolving, it's becoming increasingly sophisticated, and it's something that we all need to be aware of and taking steps to protect ourselves against.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's not just about protecting our devices or our data. It's about protecting ourselves, our families, our communities, and our way of life. So here's a final thought for you all to chew on. Given how pervasive and sophisticated cybercrime has become, and how deeply it's now intertwined with those larger criminal enterprises, what fundamental shifts do we need to make, both as individuals and as a society, to really get ahead of this curve?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is, and it's one that we all need to be thinking about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everyone. We encourage you to keep exploring these topics and maybe take a fresh look at your own digital security practices. Stay safe out there.
Stay safe.
With so many options, why choose Arizona State University?
For me, the only online option was ASU because of the quality. Their faculty was really involved with their students and care about your personal journey. The dedication to my personal development from my professors, that's been extremely valuable to me.
Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online. That's a degree better. Explore more than 300 undergraduate, graduate, and certificate programs at asuonline.asu.edu.